The Florida sun burned high above the endless stretch of concrete and steel that marked the entrance to Eglin Air Force Base. The air shimmered with heat, and the faint hum of jet engines echoed from somewhere far beyond the horizon. At the main gate, a young Air Force sergeant named James Walker leaned against the guard post, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the long empty road ahead. "Quiet day, huh?" his partner muttered, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. James shrugged. "Always is. Until someone decides to make it interesting." Moments later, a faint figure appeared at the far end of the road. A man, old, slow but steady. His posture spoke of strength long retained, though his body bore the weight of years. He wore a weathered leather jacket, a faded baseball cap pulled low over gray hair, and in his hand, a small ID card, edges worn, colors long faded. When he finally reached the guard post, James straightened up. "Good morning, sir. Can I see your identification?" The old man handed over the card without a word. James squinted at it, his brows furrowing. The card looked ancient, older than any he'd ever seen. It bore a seal he didn't recognize, and beneath the worn lamination, a name barely visible, Colonel Gregory A. King. James chuckled. "Sir, this ID is, well, it's expired. By decades, I'd say. You might want to renew it at the VA." Greg's eyes lifted, calm and unflinching. His voice carried a tone of patience that had weathered battlefields and bureaucracy alike. "That card doesn't expire, son. It grants access to every air base in the continental United States. Check your protocol database under clearance level red." James raised a brow, amused. "Level red? Sir, that's classified access. We don't even have clearance for that." "You don't need clearance," Greg said evenly. "You just need to follow procedure." But James didn't. Instead, he turned to his partner with a smirk. "You hearing this? Grandpa here thinks he's got top-secret clearance." The other guard laughed. "Maybe he's one of those conspiracy guys. Area 51 or something." Greg sighed. "Listen to me carefully, Sergeant. That card was issued directly by Section 77. It's valid." James interrupted, holding up his hand. "Sir, Section what? There's no such division in the U.S. military. This looks like a homemade fake. I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the vehicle." "I don't have a vehicle." "Then step aside. We're going to do a search." Greg's jaw tightened, but he didn't resist. He'd dealt with worse, hostile interrogations, ambushes, betrayals. Yet somehow, being handcuffed by a kid who had no idea what he was dealing with felt like a deeper wound. James patted him down roughly, then rifled through Greg's old satchel. Inside were only a few personal items, a folded photograph of 6 young men in black flight suits, a pair of aviator goggles, and a silver dog tag engraved simply with the words Unit Spectre. "What's this supposed to be?" James asked, holding it up. Greg's expression darkened. "Those are my brothers," he said quietly. "Every man in that photo is dead." James hesitated, but only for a moment. "All right, enough stories. You're coming with me." He guided Greg toward the small security office beside the gate and fastened one handcuff to a metal bar inside. Greg didn't fight. He simply sat down, breathing slowly, his gaze fixed on the distant runways. Minutes stretched into an uneasy silence. James filled out his incident report, muttering under his breath. "Old guy, expired ID, possibly delusional. No visible threat. Pending verification." Then suddenly, the base phone rang. Its shrill tone cut through the still air. James grabbed it with a hint of annoyance. "Security Post 1, Sergeant Walker speaking." A deep voice answered, calm but commanding. "Sergeant Walker. This is General Mason Fox. You are detaining a man named Gregory King, correct?" James blinked. "Yes, sir. I was just." "Release him. Immediately." "Sir." I said release him now, return his identification, and escort him to my office personally. "General, with respect, this ID looks fake. He claims some sort of special." The general's tone hardened. "Sergeant, that man is not who you think he is. And if you value your career, you'll do exactly as I say." The line went dead. James stood frozen. His partner gave him a puzzled look. "What's wrong?" He said to let him go." "Let him go? Why?" James turned to Greg, who sat calmly as if he'd heard every word. The old man gave him a faint, knowing smile. "They called, didn't they?" James swallowed hard. "Who are you?" Greg rose slowly, stretching his arms as the handcuffs clicked open. "Someone you weren't supposed to find, son." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the flags along the base road. The air felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. James followed Greg out of the post, unsure if he was escorting a man, or a ghost from the forgotten shadows of war. As they walked toward the general's office, Greg's gaze drifted toward a distant hangar, its massive doors half open. Inside, under dim light, rested the silhouette of a jet unlike any other, black, sleek, and silent. For the first time that day, Greg's expression changed. His lips parted slightly, and beneath the wrinkles, a trace of memory flickered, a memory of sky, smoke, and brothers lost. Without looking back, he murmured almost to himself, "It's still here." The young sergeant shivered. He didn't know why, but something deep inside told him that this day, the day he laughed at a stranger's old ID, was about to change everything. The corridors of Eglin Air Force Base stretched out in sterile silence as Sergeant James Walker escorted the old man toward the command building. The echo of their footsteps against the polished floor felt unnaturally loud, and James's heart thumped harder with every step. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking beside someone who shouldn't exist anymore. When they reached the end of the hall, two guards stood at attention beside a steel door marked Command Access Only. One of them saluted sharply as it slid open, revealing a spacious office bathed in the glow of afternoon light. Behind a large oak desk sat General Mason Fox, a man whose presence filled the room even before he spoke. His sharp eyes lifted from a folder marked Classified, Section 77, and locked onto Greg. "Colonel King," the general said, his tone low but steady. "It's been a long time." Greg gave a faint smile. "Too long, Mason." James's stomach twisted. "Colonel?" He looked from one man to the other, struggling to make sense of what he was hearing. The general stood and extended his hand. "You shouldn't have come unannounced." Half the base went on alert. Greg shrugged. Wasn't planning to make a scene. Just wanted to see her one last time. Mason's eyes softened. "The aircraft." Greg nodded. "The Night Reaper." The general motioned for James to wait outside, but Greg gestured for him to stay. "He should hear this," Greg said quietly. "He needs to understand." Mason hesitated, then closed the folder on his desk. "Very well." He turned toward the young sergeant. "You asked who he is, didn't you, Walker? Well, this man is Gregory King, former test pilot, special operations officer, and the last living member of Unit Spectre." James frowned. "I've never heard of that unit." "You weren't supposed to," Mason said. Unit Spectre didn't exist on paper. It was part of a black project during the Cold War, missions no one would ever acknowledge. The kind that never made it into history books. Greg stepped forward, his gaze distant. "We flew missions in and out of Soviet territory before satellites could do what they do today. No backup. No recognition. No graves for the ones who didn't make it back." For a moment, the room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. James could see something in Greg's eyes, something that lived far beyond medals or glory. "I thought Section 77 was just a myth," James murmured. Mason sighed. "Most of the military thinks so too. But they were real. Section 77 handled operations so classified even the president needed special clearance to know about them. Spectre was their airborne division. Highly skilled pilots who could fly into radar shadows and vanish like ghosts." Greg looked down at his hands. They trembled slightly. "We were ghosts, all right. Flew missions no one believed in, for causes no one would ever thank us for. But we believed in each other. That was enough." The general's voice softened. "You were the best of us, Greg." Greg didn't answer. His mind was already somewhere else, decades away, in a sky burning with northern lights and tracer fire. Later that afternoon, Mason arranged an escort to take Greg and James to the hangar. As they approached, the massive doors slid open with a low groan. Inside, under dim overhead lamps, stood the Night Reaper, a stealth jet unlike anything James had ever seen. Its edges were sharp and angular, its paint absorbing light like a shadow given form. Dust clung to its surface, but even in stillness, it radiated menace and grace. Greg stopped in front of it, breath catching in his throat. His reflection flickered faintly across the black hull. "We built her ourselves," he whispered. "Piece by piece. No manuals, no blueprints. Just raw engineering and madness." James stepped closer, his voice quiet. "She looks otherworldly." "She was," Greg said, running a hand along the cold metal. "Mach 3. Cloaked against radar. Could fly so high we could see the curve of the Earth." The general folded his arms. This was the aircraft that ended the Frostline incident. James looked at him. Frostline. Mason exhaled. The mission that never happened. Or at least, that's what the world was told. Spectre flew across the Arctic to intercept a rogue Soviet satellite armed with a warhead. They succeeded, but only one of them came back alive. Greg's jaw tightened. That one was me. The hangar fell into silence again. Dust floated in the sunlight streaming from above, dancing like ghostly particles of memory. James felt his throat tighten. "So all your team?" "Gone," Greg said softly. "I told myself I'd visit once a year. See the jet, leave a coin for each of them. I missed last year. Guess I was afraid my time was coming soon." Mason placed a hand on Greg's shoulder. "You've earned your peace, old friend." Greg smiled faintly. "Peace isn't free, Mason. You taught me that." He turned to James. "You remind me of someone from my team. Young, stubborn, full of fire. Don't lose that. Just learn to listen before you judge." James lowered his head, guilt washing over him. "Sir, Greg raised a hand. "You don't owe me an apology. You did what soldiers are trained to do. Follow orders. Question threats. But someday, you'll learn there are ghosts walking among you, men who gave up everything so you could sleep without fear." Mason's voice broke the silence. "Come on. There's something you should see." He led them to a small control panel near the hangar's edge. With a few key presses, lights flickered on across the floor, illuminating a bronze plaque set into the concrete. The inscription read, "In memory of Unit Spectre." They flew into the dark so that others might live in the light. Greg knelt before it, fingertips tracing each engraved name. His eyes glistened. "Good to see you again, boys," he whispered. "Sorry I'm late." A hush fell over the hangar. Even James, who just hours ago had mocked the man, felt the weight of history pressing down on him. For the first time since he'd put on the uniform, he truly understood what honor meant. The old man rose slowly, his body trembling, but his spirit unbroken. He turned to the general with a faint grin. "Now about that cup of coffee you owe me." Mason chuckled softly. "I'll make it strong. Just the way you used to like it." As they walked out of the hangar, James lingered behind for a moment, staring at the Night Reaper's dark silhouette. The faint sound of metal settling echoed like a sigh. He couldn't help but wonder if some ghosts never really left, if they simply waited for someone to remember them. That night, the wind swept across Eglin Air Force Base with a low, haunting whistle. The hangars stood in eerie stillness, and the faint hum of generators echoed like distant thunder. Inside the command building, General Mason Fox sat at his desk, a half-empty mug of coffee beside a stack of sealed documents marked eyes only. His eyes burned from the glow of the monitor as classified alerts scrolled across the screen. Then, the secure phone on his desk rang. Not the regular line, not even the encrypted base channel. This was a direct call through an ancient system few knew still existed. The small red light blinked steadily. Mason hesitated, hand hovering above the receiver. He hadn't seen that number appear in decades. Finally, he picked it up. General Fox speaking. A calm, flat voice answered. "Verification code Sierra 57 Alpha. Confirm your clearance." Mason straightened. "Fox. Clearance Echo 17. A long pause followed, broken only by the faint static of a signal bouncing through layers of encrypted satellites. Then, the voice spoke again. "Good evening, General. This is Control." Mason's blood ran cold. The name alone brought back memories buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself they were fiction. "Control," he said quietly. I didn't think you existed anymore. We exist as long as we are needed. And tonight, we are needed. Mason's gaze flicked to the photograph on his wall, Greg King and the rest of the Spectre unit, taken decades ago in front of the Night Reaper. This is about King, isn't it? Yes. The voice was steady, emotionless. He accessed restricted ground. You are to ensure his presence remains undocumented. There must be no official record of him entering or leaving your facility. Mason frowned. With all due respect, he's not a threat. He's an old man, and he came here for closure. You misunderstand, General. The threat isn't him. It's the memory of what he represents. Mason gripped the edge of his desk. He's the last living link to Section 77. You owe him better than that. The voice didn't change. Section 77 owes no one. Our existence depends on silence. Make sure it stays that way. The line went dead. For a long moment, Mason sat frozen, listening to the faint echo of his own heartbeat. The air in the office felt heavier now, as if the ghosts of old secrets were closing in. Down the hall, in the guest quarters of the base, Greg sat on the edge of his bed staring at the silver dog tag in his hand. The metal gleamed faintly under the lamp. He could almost hear the voices of his old crew again, Jackson's sarcastic laughter, Reed's nervous jokes, and Ortiz humming off-key while tightening a bolt. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an old cassette recorder. When he pressed play, a faint crackle of static filled the air, followed by a voice, young, confident, alive. Spectre 6 reporting in. Sky clear. Fuel steady. Godspeed, brothers. Greg closed his eyes, letting the words pull him back into the sky of another lifetime. He saw flashes of white ice below, red lights on his radar, and the violent tremor of the Night Reaper as flak tore through the clouds. He saw them go down, one by one, until the only voice left on the radio was his own. When the tape clicked to an end, Greg exhaled slowly. He whispered into the silence, I told you I'd come back. A soft knock came from the door. Come in, he said. James stepped inside, his uniform slightly wrinkled, his expression uncertain. Sir, General Fox asked me to check on you. Greg smiled faintly. No need to call me sir. Those days are long gone. James hesitated before taking a seat across from him. I, wanted to apologize again. For earlier. I didn't know who you were. Greg waved a hand dismissively. You don't need to apologize, son. You did your job. If anything, I'm glad there are still men like you standing guard. Even if you gave an old ghost a hard time. James chuckled softly. Still, I should have listened. Greg leaned forward. Listening isn't something they teach in boot camp. You'll learn it when you've lost enough. James frowned slightly, trying to read the weight behind those words. Can I ask something, Colonel? Why come back now? After all these years. Greg's eyes drifted toward the window, where the faint outline of the hangar could be seen under the moonlight. Because I made a promise. Every year, I come back to pay my respects. But last year, I didn't. My health's been slipping. I figured this might be my last chance. James nodded slowly. You're not planning to stay long, are you? No, Greg said quietly. Just long enough to say goodbye. A moment of silence settled between them before James stood to leave. If you need anything, I'm stationed just outside. Greg smiled again, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Thank you, Sergeant. As James closed the door, Greg turned off the light. The room fell into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the moon spilling through the blinds. He thought about Mason, about Section 77, about the call that had no doubt already come. He'd known it would happen eventually. Men like him weren't meant to resurface. They were supposed to fade quietly, like vapor trails in the night sky. But Greg King had never been the kind of man to go quietly. He picked up his old military watch, still ticking faintly despite its cracked glass, and whispered, "One last mission, boys." Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the flagpole. And somewhere deep within the base, the hum of the Night Reaper's maintenance system came alive for the first time in decades, as if the jet itself was waiting. Before dawn, a pale light crept over Eglin Air Force Base. The air was cool, the sky still painted in hues of blue and gray. The base was silent, except for the distant rumble of generators and the rhythmic steps of the early patrol. Inside Hangar 9, however, something stirred. Greg King stood before the Night Reaper, his wrinkled hands resting against the cold black metal. The jet loomed before him like a sleeping beast, half forgotten but never dead. He had spent the last hour walking around it, his fingers tracing every panel, every scar of the machine that had once carried him through the storm. He whispered softly, "You ready for one last flight, girl?" The faint click of a door echoed from behind him. James stepped inside, still in his uniform, eyes wide. "Sir, Colonel, what are you doing here?" The hangars locked down. Greg turned, his face calm but resolute. "Just saying goodbye properly." "You can't be in here," James said. "The general hasn't cleared." Greg interrupted gently. "Son, if I waited for permission my whole life, half the world would look very different right now." He gave the younger man a wry smile. Then, something shifted in his tone, soft, but full of meaning. "I'm not stealing her, if that's what you're thinking. I just want to start her up. Hear her breathe again." James hesitated. There was something about the way Greg spoke, steady, unbroken, that made it hard to say no. "They'll court-martial me if I let you do that." Greg looked at him. "You'll have to decide what's worth more, your record or your conscience." That simple line hung in the air like a challenge. Meanwhile, in the command building, General Mason Fox entered his office only to find his secure terminal flashing. The system displayed a message. SEC-77 active. Surveillance online. Subject, King Gregory A. He froze. "No," he muttered under his breath. "Not again." He reached for the phone, dialing internal security. "This is General Fox. Disable the surveillance feed in Hangar 9. That's an order." "Sir, we can't. The feed's been remotely accessed by an external command, authorization level 7. Mason's blood ran cold. Level 7. That was Section 77's clearance, one that technically no longer existed. "God help us," he whispered. He grabbed his coat and sprinted out of the office. Back in Hangar 9, Greg climbed the narrow ladder into the cockpit. The seat creaked under his weight. His movements were slow, deliberate, every gesture echoing with memory. He flipped the first switch, and the jet came alive with a low hum. Lights flickered across the dashboard, the instruments glowing one by one as if the aircraft itself remembered its old pilot. James stood below, torn between duty and awe. "You're actually doing it," he breathed. Greg smiled down at him. "A man's gotta finish what he started." "Sir, you're not cleared to." "Neither were we," Greg said. "But that never stopped us before." The turbines whined, coughing out bursts of exhaust. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the hangar walls. Dust fell from the rafters, and alarms began to flicker red. At that moment, Mason burst through the side door, shouting over the roar, "Greg! Shut it down. You'll kill yourself." Greg looked over the edge of the cockpit, his voice calm. "She's not taking off, Mason. I just wanted to hear her heartbeat again." The general slowed, breathless, realizing the truth. Greg wasn't trying to escape. He was reliving a moment, one final connection to the ghosts he'd carried all these years. Mason shouted up, "Section 77's watching. They think you're a liability." Greg's laugh was low, almost sad. "I've been a liability since the day I came home." The hum of the engines faded as he powered them down. The echo lingered like a sigh. Then the hangar lights flickered, and a loudspeaker crackled to life overhead. A cold, mechanical voice filled the room. "Colonel Gregory King. You are hereby ordered to stand down. Section 77 has terminated your clearance. You are to remain under supervision until further notice." James looked up, confused. "What the hell is this?" Mason clenched his fists. "They're trying to erase him. Again." Greg climbed down from the cockpit slowly. His feet touched the floor with deliberate calm. "You tell your masters they can bury my name, but they'll never bury what we did." The voice on the intercom ignored him. "Non-compliance will result in immediate containment." Suddenly, the hangar doors groaned as two unmarked black vehicles pulled up outside. Armed agents in plain uniforms stepped out, their faces obscured by tinted visors. James instinctively stepped in front of Greg. What's going on? He hasn't done anything wrong. Mason joined him, his voice sharp. You're trespassing on a U.S. Air Force Base. Identify yourselves. The lead agent stopped just short of the threshold. We are Section 77. Greg chuckled softly, almost wistfully. So they send the ghosts to collect their own. The agents hesitated. One of them, clearly younger than the rest, lowered his weapon. Sir, are you really him? The Spectre pilot. Greg's eyes softened. That depends. Do you still believe in the kind of men who disappear so others can live? For a long second, no one moved. Then slowly, the young agent gave a subtle nod. The others looked at him, uncertain. Mason seized the moment. This man's record stays intact. You try to take him by force, and you'll answer to me. The lead agent hesitated. Orders are orders, General. Greg stepped forward, voice calm but commanding. Then tell Control they've already failed. Because as long as one man remembers Spectre, Section 77 will never die. The agent stared at him, then at the gleaming black jet behind him. For a heartbeat, time stood still. Then, without a word, the agents turned and walked back to their vehicles. The engines roared to life, and within moments they vanished into the early morning fog. James exhaled, hands trembling. Did that just happen? Mason nodded slowly. It did. And it means Section 77 isn't gone, they're just hiding like they always have. Greg looked at the hangar one last time. They can hide all they want. The truth doesn't need to be seen to survive. He patted the Night Reaper's wing gently. Rest easy, girl. You did your duty. The first light of dawn broke through the open hangar, bathing the jet in gold. It shimmered like a shadow made of sunlight, a fitting monument for men who had lived and died in silence. Mason placed a hand on Greg's shoulder. You need rest. Greg smiled faintly. After one more sunrise. The morning sun rose slowly over Eglin Air Force Base, spilling a soft golden light across the runways and the distant hangars. For the first time in years, the base felt alive, not because of movement or noise, but because of the quiet presence of something remembered. The Night Reaper sat gleaming under the open sky, its black surface glinting faintly, the once-forgotten aircraft now reborn in the dawn. Greg King stood beside it, dressed in a freshly pressed flight jacket that General Fox had found for him in the archives. His old unit patch, Spectre's ghostly emblem, was still sewn into the sleeve. The stitches had faded, but the meaning hadn't. James stood beside him, straight-backed and silent, while Mason watched from a few steps away, arms crossed, his face unreadable. The air was cool, the kind of morning that carried the scent of jet fuel and salt from the nearby Gulf. Greg's breath formed small clouds in the chill, and for a long while, no one spoke. Finally, Mason broke the silence. Section 77 won't bother you again. They'll scrub the records, pretend this never happened. But as far as I'm concerned, Colonel, your story doesn't end that way. Greg smiled faintly. You can't fight ghosts with paperwork, Mason. Maybe not, Mason replied. But I can make sure people remember your men. The ones who didn't come home. Greg turned toward him, his old eyes glimmering. You'd risk your career for that? Mason shrugged. Some things are worth the risk. He motioned to a small podium near the hangar entrance. A new plaque rested there, covered by a dark cloth. The general nodded toward James. Go ahead, Sergeant. James stepped forward and pulled the cloth free. Beneath it, engraved into polished steel, were the words, Unit Spectre Memorial, in honor of those who served in silence. Their courage was unseen, but their legacy endures. Below the inscription were 6 names, each etched with care. At the bottom, one more line had been added overnight. Colonel Gregory A. King, the last ghost. For a moment, Greg just stared at it. His breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled as he traced each name slowly, whispering under his breath, Reed. Jackson. Ortiz, you made it home, boys. Mason's voice softened. The Air Force will deny the unit ever existed, but I won't. I'll keep this memorial here. You have my word. Greg nodded, swallowing hard. Thank you, Mason. That's more than I ever asked for. Later that day, the 3 men sat outside the hangar, a thermos of coffee between them. The smell of roasted beans mixed with a faint tang of oil and metal. Greg poured himself a cup and stared out toward the runways where jets began their daily drills. James broke the silence. "You really think Section 77's gone?" Greg chuckled. "Son, nothing like that ever really dies. They'll stay in the shadows, watching, waiting. That's what they're built for. Then why not expose them?" Greg's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "Because some secrets are heavy. If you hand them to the world, you risk breaking it." He took a sip of the bitter coffee and smiled. "Besides, not all ghosts need to be chased away. Some just need to rest." James leaned back, thoughtful. "I think I get it now. You weren't fighting for medals or orders. You were fighting for each other." "That's all any soldier really fights for," Greg said softly. Mason watched them quietly. In the years he had served, he had buried more men than he could count, but seeing Greg there, alive, resolute, brought something back he hadn't felt in decades. Pride. Gratitude. Hope. The old man's voice broke the silence again. "You know, Mason, when they told us we'd be erased from history, I didn't mind. History's just words on a page. What mattered was that we kept the world turning while no one was looking." He smiled faintly. "Now I see it wasn't about disappearing, it was about making sure others never had to face what we did." As the sun climbed higher, base personnel began to gather around the memorial, curious at first, then quietly reverent. They didn't know the full story, and they probably never would, but something about the solemn plaque and the way their commanding officers stood beside it told them enough. James stepped forward and called the crowd to attention. His voice carried steady and strong. "Today, we honor those who served without recognition, who risked everything for a peace the world never saw. Let this memorial remind us that true valor doesn't seek fame, it endures in silence." He saluted the plaque, and for the first time since dawn, Greg stood fully upright, returning the salute with trembling precision. When the ceremony ended, Mason approached Greg quietly. "What will you do now?" Greg looked toward the open sky. "Go home. Visit my wife's grave. Maybe fix up that old truck she loved. But I think I'll keep coming back once a year." "You're always welcome here," Mason said. Greg smiled. "I know." That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hangar, Greg walked alone toward the Night Reaper one last time. The hangar lights cast long shadows across the floor, and the black jet gleamed like a monument to everything he'd lived through. He rested his hand against the fuselage and whispered, "We did it, boys. We're home." The metal was cold, but somehow it felt alive, like the memory of flight still hummed beneath the surface. When he finally turned to leave, James was waiting by the door. The young sergeant stood at attention, eyes forward, the weight of the day etched into his posture. Greg gave him a slow nod. "Take care of them, son. The old ones. The forgotten ones. They're worth more than all the medals in the world." James's voice was steady. "I will, sir." Greg walked out into the golden light of evening, his shadow long across the tarmac. The wind caught the edges of his jacket, lifting it just slightly, like invisible hands guiding him onward. For a brief moment, as the sun broke through the clouds, it seemed as though 6 faint silhouettes walked beside him, his brothers in arms, keeping pace in silence. And then just as quickly they were gone. Greg King didn't look back. He didn't need to. The ghosts of Unit Spectre were finally at rest, and the world, for once, had remembered their names.